Even though Latin America gained their independence during this era, a lot of the same problems that plagued them under European control continued to plague them as new nations. And so, for example, the class distinctions based on race didn't disappear. A lot of the freedoms were not extended to the lower classes. Even though slavery ended, a lot of the lower classes continued to be exploited for their labor. There was no extension of freedom of religion. And so a lot of the old problems continued even with independence. They also suffered from political fragmentation and division throughout Latin America. One of the big issues for Latin America after gaining independence was political instability. And so most of Latin America, again, create these republics. But the problem with Latin America is they really didn't have a large class of available leaders. Unlike the United States, when the United States gained their independence, they were already used to self-rule. And so they already had a class of political leaders ready to step up and take over. Latin America didn't have that, partially because Spain had kept much tighter control of their colonies and didn't allow the local autonomy like the British had. And so when they gained their independence, their only really leaders were military leaders. And so that's going to be a problem that persists throughout Latin America. Also, there was a lot of political division. The white minorities kind of dominated politics. Only about 5% of males could actually vote. And many countries are going to jump from one constitution to another, trying to find some source of stability. There was also a lot of conflict between your liberals and your conservatives. There was a lot of conflict between your rural population and your urban population. There was conflict between your Roman Catholic Church and those who wanted a more secular society. And then another growing issue was the power of these caudillos. And so because Latin America didn't have a large class of political leaders, a lot of that leadership is going to fall to military leaders. And so military leaders began to seize power and take control over these republics. And so they used the military to take power and then used it to stay in control and basically create these one-party dictatorships. And so in some cases, some of these caudillos were well loved because they restored order and they kept order. And some of them identified with the common people. But most of them were kind of allied with the upper aristocracy, and because of that, limited a lot of freedoms. When we look at Mexico, Mexico is going to, after a very brief period of time, about a year of having a dictatorship after gaining independence, they're going to become a republic. But the republic, like many parts of Latin America, is going to come under the control of these caudillos. And so these caudillos ruled Mexico for a long period of time, almost a century. But after the Mexican-American War, we're going to see a period of liberal reforms begin. And this is going to come under President Benito Juarez. Benito Juarez is going to implement the La Reforma. This is a liberal movement, and ultimately what he wanted to do was extend freedoms and power. He wanted to limit the power of the church. He wanted to limit the power of the military. And so one of the things he does is he seizes a lot of church property and then puts it up for sale. He extends voting to most men were able to now vote. He also extended freedom of speech. However, a lot of his attempts at reform end up backfiring. And he had good intentions, but it led to a lot of negative results. For example, his attempt at land redistribution. Well, he seized power from the church and put it up for sale. However, most of that land was bought up by these large landowners. And so half of the population still own no land even after his reforms. Furthermore, it's going to lead to a conservative backlash. As he tried to implement these liberal reforms, conservatives began to push back. And this is going to lead to a civil war. Conservatives are going to try to overthrow President Juarez. And it's these conservatives who actually invite France to come in and help put down Juarez. And France is going to step in. They saw it as an opportunity to kind of seize some economic gain in Mexico. They're going to replace President Juarez with a monarch, the Emperor Maximilian, and return Mexico now under French control. However, Mexico resists, and Mexico ultimately is going to defeat these French forces and win back their independence. In fact, that's what we celebrate with the celebration of Cinco de Mayo. And President Juarez is going to come back to power. But when he comes back in a more autocratic fashion. He felt he needed to be more autocratic in order to keep stability and suspends a lot of his more liberal reforms. So that's going to get us to the Mexican Revolution. And this is kind of crossing over into the next era, into the contemporary era. However, it makes sense to cover it here as well. So, the Mexican Revolution. After Juarez, Porfirio Diaz is going to take over. And he implements this period of very rapid economic growth. However, a lot of that economic growth was under foreign control. Also, his regime was full of corruption, and he basically, over time, becomes more of a dictator. And so he becomes a very unpopular leader. Furthermore, a lot of the reforms that were needed were not implemented. For example, 95% of peasants had no land. And so the middle classes and the peasants are going to lead this push to overthrow Diaz, and that leads to the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. So the Mexican Revolution starts with the peasants, and the peasants are going to lead these rebel armies in the countryside, and they're going to lead this push to overthrow Diaz. And so you have Pancho Villa, who leads a group of northern rebels and landless peasants in the countryside. And then in the southern regions, you have Emiliano Zapata, who led this big push for land and liberty. That becomes kind of the slogan of the Mexican Revolution. They wanted land redistributed to the lower classes, and they wanted an extension of freedoms to the lower classes. And so they are going to help drive Diaz out of office. And Francisco Madero is going to rule at first. He's going to kind of take over, and Madero had tried to win a free election over Diaz beforehand, but in response to this, Diaz had thrown him in prison. And so when he gets out of prison, Madero helps kind of lead this push for a revolt and a revolution. And so he briefly takes over, driving Diaz out of office, but he was against a lot of the things that these peasant revolutionaries wanted. He was against a lot of the major land reforms that were needed. And so ultimately, Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata are going to rise up and fail to support Madero. And so this leads to a new leader kind of seizing power, General Huerta. General Huerta wanted to create a dictatorship. Well, again, that didn't coincide with what these peasant rebels wanted. And so they're going to rise up against General Huerta as well. And so over time, you have these peasant armies kind of leading this revolution. Well, the United States eventually steps in because they wanted to ensure stability, especially along their border. And so they're going to step in and they're going to help kind of put down some of these rebels. They're going to chase down Pancho Villa. He's able to elude the U.S. for a while, but they defeat some of his forces. And over time, gradually the revolution begins to kind of die out. However, even though eventually the revolution is put down and President Carranza is going to take over. He's going to help restore some order. And then in 1920, one of his generals is actually going to overthrow Carranza, and Alvaro Obregón is going to take over. He's going to be elected in 1920, and this restores the stability back to Mexico. And so even though ultimately the revolution was put down, a lot of the things they fought for would be included in a new constitution in 1917. This new constitution included land reforms and redistribution of land to the lower classes. It extended voting rights to most men. It restricted some of the power and property of the Catholic Church. It helped improve the education system in Mexico as well. And it helped improve working conditions. It created things like an 8-hour workday and a minimum wage. And it would take some time for all of this to be fully implemented into Mexico's society, but many of the things that the revolution had fought for would be included in this new constitution.